Now, most would have struggled to be able to name the director of the Australian War Memorial until Brendan Nelson came along 7 years ago. That's how long he's been at the helm of this very special institution here in Canberra that most Australians, I'm sure, have visited at some point in their life. He's done a lot in those 7 years, including, most recently, securing nearly $500 million in funding with bipartisan support for a huge expansion of the War Memorial. It's been somewhat controversial. Some critics don't think that's the best way to spend taxpayers' money, but Brendan Nelson is a passionate advocate of this expansion and the role the War Memorial plays. He'll finish up at the War Memorial at the end of this year, and I spoke to him just after he announced his decision today. Brendan Nelson, thanks for joining us this afternoon. Look, I've known you since way back when you were head of the AMA, wearing an earring back in those days, then a humble backbencher, a minister for education, for defence, a leader of the opposition, and then, of course, into some diplomatic roles, ambassador to the EU and NATO. But can I ask you about this role that you've been in for the last 7 years? Was it what you expected it to be, and how did it compare to some of those other very high-profile roles you've held?
Well, when I was in Brussels early in 2012, Julia Gillard asked me if I would consider extending my term there, and I appreciated the offer, but I felt that 3 years would be enough. And I said to my wife, what I do when I go back to Australia, I want to do something meaningful. I found out quite by accident the director's job at the Memorial was available.
How did you find out?
Well, I found out, I was on the phone to Warren Snowden, who was then the Veterans Affairs Minister, his Chief of Staff, talking about Anzac Day in Flanders and other things, and went on to ask how Steve Gower was, my predecessor at the Memorial, and he said to Ross Bain, he said to me, have you read the Canberra Times? I said, no, certainly not from Brussels. And he said, well, the job's available because Steve's leaving. The moment I hung up the phone, I filled in the job application.
So you knew straight away, that could be something for me?
Well, there was not a moment's hesitation, and I had been thinking about it. I felt as if I had more public service in me to do something good and perhaps meaningful for our country.
What were some of your friends and colleagues saying to you about that? You'd been leader of the Liberal Party, you'd been cabinet minister at the highest levels. What advice did you get at the time?
Well, I went through the process. Peter Costello asked me a few years ago how I got the job, and I said, Peter, it was novel. I filled in a job application, I went for an interview, and they rang up 3 weeks later and said, you got the job. And so when I came into the job, I didn't really know what to expect. I said to a person closely associated with the process who thought that I wasn't a suitable candidate because I'd never run a cultural institution, and I said, well, there are 300 experts at the Memorial who've forgotten more than I will ever know. But the job is to apply intellectual rigour to the process of exercising judgment, drawing on all the expertise both within it and outside it. And one of the things I've learned, which Kerry Stokes and I have discussed, is that the most important quality we need in whoever is the director of the Memorial is emotional empathy for the stories of these servicemen and women and their families. Well, that's more important than anything else.
Yeah, you don't need to be a military historian
in that
role. You give it a pretty good shake, though, I've got to say, listening to you talk about the many things I've interviewed you about over the years. But look, in terms of the leadership you've brought to the organisation, there's a list we can go through, whether it's opening the Afghanistan exhibition, returning the Meningate Lions, the World War I centenary commemorations that only recently wrapped up. But then the big one, of course, securing the nearly $500 million for the expansion of the War Memorial. Can I suggest one of the things, though, perhaps it's a smaller thing, that I've noticed has had a big impact, and that's these last post ceremonies that happen every day at the War Memorial at the end of the day. They do have a big impact on families who've had someone serve.
They certainly do, David, and the 3 years that I was privileged to be our ambassador in Brussels, of all of the things I did, whether it was at the North Atlantic Council, at NATO, whether it was engagement with US presidents through to leaders of all sorts of countries, shaping EU, it was the time I spent in the cemeteries and the battlefields and at the Meningate in Ypres that meant the most to me. On my very last night in Brussels, the chairman of the Last Post Association at Ypres under the Meningate leaned over to me and he said, Ambassador, this is your 74th visit. And I said, Benoit, are you counting them? He said,
74th?
Yeah. He said, we weren't at first. He said, but we noticed you've been coming more often than anyone we've ever seen. And I said, mate, if it was in Brussels instead of an hour and a half drive, I would have come every night. But I used to look up at the names. There are 55,000 names of the missing there. The dead, bodies never found, 6,192 Australians. And I used to think, why don't they tell us something about one of these people? So on my very first day at the Australian War Memorial, standing in that commemorative area, cloaked by those cloisters and the names of our 102,800 dead, I thought, we can do this. We have historians and researchers. We'll do the last post, but we'll do more. We'll tell the story of just one of these people.
Well, let me ask you how you handle that, because you must have seen over the 7 years you've been there some pretty emotional moments, maybe not at the big ceremonies, but even in the quiet moments in the corridors there at the War Memorial. And I think you reflected on one today that was only last week.
Yeah, that's right.
What have been some of the moments that really got you?
On the 13th of August 2013, we opened the Afghanistan exhibition 8 months after I had arrived. I had been told it would be a decade before we could do it. We had no money, we had no space. And anyway, we did it. And Mrs. Pam Palmer and I were standing in front of the cowling from the Black Hawk helicopter, which had crashed in Kandahar in 2010, killing 3 Australians, an American, and severely wounding the other commandos. Her son Scott was one of the 3 killed, and that cowling was used as a stretcher to bring out her son's body. She just wrapped her arms around me and buried her face in my shoulder and said, "Thank you for making my son's life mean something and his memory live." And we've had programs of soldiers in residence. I said,
that gives them that connection, doesn't it, to
of course,
what a big part of their life and what they've lost.
It's extraordinarily important, and unless you've done anything in life, you can never understand, no matter how much you have the imaginative capacity to understand the world through the eyes of others, unless you've served in the military, and you and I haven't, you don't really understand. But I've had some exposure to it, as you know, a high-pressured, highly adrenalised environment. You're in a tribe, you're in with a group of men and women who are tightly bound, often in bloody sacrifice, in the most extraordinary circumstances, hostile environments. You're coming back to a country that's got no idea.
But, and this is the thing, clearly that is the case for those who've served and for those who've been around it and those who've experienced it. And you do talk about the War Memorial in quite reverential terms about, you know, it being the soul of the nation, I suppose, in some ways. But do you understand critics who say, well, it's not that to us, and it's even sometimes mocked as a war world, you know, military museum, particularly with the expansion of nearly $500 million that's going to happen. Can you understand that it doesn't mean that much to some Australians?
I appreciate people have that view. Some people have that view. They're entitled to have it. I've got to say I struggle to understand it, however. And look, only a few days ago with the tragedy in Sydney, I see reports in News Limited and Daily Telegraph speaking about the Anzac spirit in those just everyday civilians that risk their lives to get this man under control. And only last night, speaking at a very large event for women in service in the Great Hall, I observed that Kirsty Bowden on the 3rd of June 2017, 3 terrorists weaponise a van on the London Bridge. They want to kill and maim as many people as they can. One young woman, one young Australian woman, she runs in the opposite direction. She's running toward it, concerned not for her welfare and safety, but that of others. And days after her death, she was one of 8 killed, her family went into the Australian media and said of her, she was selfless, caring and brave. One
of the other issues that's sometimes raised, I know we've talked a bit about this before, is yes, while all those heroic moments in Australia's past are there, some of the more difficult aspects of our past aren't. In particular, you know, we're learning more and more nowadays about battles between Indigenous Australians and the first European settlers. Do you ever see a point in the future where that is recognised either at the War Memorial or in some other museum setting?
Well, firstly, George III's instructions to Captain Phillip were to apply maximum beneficence to the natives as they were described. But inevitably and tragically, violence was perpetrated against Indigenous people in the process of dispossession through the 19th and earlier 20th centuries. It was perpetrated by pastoralists, by police militia and mounted Aboriginal militia. The decision in the High Court in native title in Mabo was that it was a peaceful settlement. Well, in one sense it was, but tragically it wasn't. And for us at the Australian War Memorial, the view that the Council has, the view of the Indigenous Servicemen and Veterans Association, is that this is a story that should be told at the National Museum of Australia. Having said that, as you and I are speaking here today, when you step into the Australian War Memorial, the very first thing you'll see, right opposite the bullet-ridden Gallipoli landing boat, permanently hung, is a 5.5 metre wide painting done by 17 AP Wylands artists, which I commissioned in 2016 to depict the importance of defence of land, of country, to Aboriginal Australians. As you walk through the galleries, you'll see Aboriginal faces and their stories being told.
So it is a part of the story.
Of course it is. It has to be, David, because what's important is that Australians, when they come to the Australian War Memorial, and this is a really important point which I make to our political class in particular, the Australian War Memorial is a place that is unifying. Everyone is equal. Everyone's equal in death. No rank, no military honours. There's no party politics. There's no religion, and there's no race. But within that framework is and has to be accorded a special place to these first Australians. With everything they endured through the 19th century, they then denied their Aboriginality, denied their families and kinship to enlist, serve, fight, suffer and die for the young nation that had taken so much from them. So our responsibility is to make sure when people, for example, come to the Australian War Memorial, that they have a context in which these first Australians served.
Now, Brendan Nelson, you've clearly loved this job, and you've shone in this role, as many have noted. Why are you leaving, and what is next?
Well, one of the important characteristics of leadership in my view and my experience is knowing when it's time to go. When it is time for new leadership and renewal. 7 years may not seem a long time, but it's a fair time to invest what I've been able to give to the Australian War Memorial. I think certainly the memorial has changed. Its understanding and awareness amongst the Australian people has certainly been enhanced. The role of Director of the Australian War Memorial has changed. We're now well and truly progressed with our project to create more spaces for these young servicemen and women. And the easiest thing for me to do would be to stay. I have a lot of everyday people who just stop me every day and say, you've got to be there forever and so on. But I think it's time. And
so what do you do?
I don't know exactly what I'm going to do next, but whatever it is, I need to do something. I certainly don't intend to retire, but I want to do something that is meaningful, challenging, and has some importance to our country. So
You're not drawn back to politics, just to be clear on that.
No. Over the last few years, I did have a few people say that I should go back, but I won't be doing it.
Well, we look forward with interest to seeing what indeed that turns out to be, and wish you well. Brendan Nelson, thank you.
Thank you, David.